welcome to the National Work Zone Safety Information Clearinghouse in our quarterly webinar series. Today we're particularly pleased to be doing this webinar as it is being held in conjunction with National Work Zone Awareness Week, held annually to commemorate those workers who are and motorists who are killed each year in work zones and to promote safety around work zones, so we see less and less of those every year. Today we are pleased to offer this webinar in cooperation with the American Society of Safety Engineers, who's the secretariat for the standard that will be discussed today. Just as a couple of reminders, if you are viewing this webinar from a conference room or there are multiple viewers, please send us the number of viewers in to the address that's listed on the screen, as we like to track how many people are attending these webinars, as they are provided at no cost. Secondly, if you're interested in receiving professional development hours, you can also register for those at the website indicated, and this information will be repeated again at the end of the webinar. And also you can find it at the National Work Zone Safety Information Clearinghouse, that's workzonesafety.org, and at the page where this webinar is presented, it will be there. Also, this webinar will be archived and will be available for viewing immediately after the live showing. The American Society of Safety Engineers has provided a generous discount to the folks who are attending the webinar, and so if you sign up, you can purchase a copy of the new standard at a 20% discount. And again, the link is provided here, and we'll provide it again at the end of the webinar and also on the website. So we thank our partners at ASSE for doing that for us. Today we are going to be having a presentation by Scott Schneider. Scott Schneider is the Director of Occupational Safety and Health for the Laborers Health and Safety Fund of North America. He's a member of the ANSI A10 committee and was also chairman of the work group that developed this standard. The A1047 standard, as Scott will talk about, is a brand new standard that was issued to deal with matters relating to work zone safety. Scott has been in this industry, has been an occupational safety and health specialist for some 30 years and is recognized internationally for his work in noise and ergonomics. I've known Scott personally for well over 20 years, and we've worked together very closely on a number of initiatives, including most recently for about the past 7 years, we've been working in a work zone safety consortia with a number of government agencies, labor organizations, and associations developing new training products. One of them is the Roadway Safety Program, which is also available on the Work Zone Clearinghouse site. So we're very pleased to have Scott here with us to discuss the new A1047 standard. So with that, we'll turn the time to Scott.
Thanks, Brad. And I appreciate the opportunity to do this webinar. And I wanted to start by thanking Travis Parsons, who worked on this very closely with me and did quite a bit of the work on this standard. He works with me at the Laborers Health and Safety Fund. Laborers Health and Safety Fund is part of the Laborers International Union, which represents about 500,000 mostly construction workers in the U.S. and Canada. So here's the agenda for today's webinar. First, sort of introduce the webinar. We're going to talk a little about the history of the standard, give an overview of the standard, and then at the end, we'll have time for questions. I expect we'll have about, the webinar will go about 40 minutes or so, 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 or 20 minutes for discussion and questions. Okay, on the history of the standard, we first started proposing the standard in 2006. It went through many different iterations back and forth. It was intended to fill a gap because there are very few OSHA standards or ANSI standards that address road or highway construction. And this is one of the few A10 standards that addresses hazards vertically in one particular industry. There's about 45 or so A10 standards that are developed by the committee. Now, the standard has about 15 sections. First is the scope and purpose. The second is the definition section. Third deals with traffic control. Then flagger safety. And then the other sections deal with some of the major hazards in road construction, particularly things like run-over and back-over prevention, equipment operator safety, excavation safety, electrical safety, safety with power tools, fall prevention, reduction of musculoskeletal problems, protection from health hazards, illumination for night work, personal protective equipment, and lastly, paving operations. So I'm going to review very briefly what's in each of these sections. Okay, the scope. This covers all workers doing construction, maintenance, or repair work on any area of any highway. The purpose is to prevent worker injuries and illnesses, to establish safe work practices, and prevent vehicular crashes. We do, as in most ANSI A10 standards, give exceptions to the letter of the standard that if there are practical difficulties, unnecessary hardship, new developments, you can provide exceptions to the standard, but in doing so you have to provide equivalent protection to what's in the standard. We do reference a lot of other standards within this standard, a number of ANSI standards, federal highway standards including the manual and uniform traffic control devices, ASTM standards, OSHA standards, the NCHRP 350 report, and I want to point out that ANSI standards tend to go beyond what federal regulations require. It's not a rubber stamp of federal regulations. They often represent what's best practices in the industry. The A10 committee is very diverse, has about 74 members representing industry, labor, technical consultants, trade associations, and government. So it was a very diverse group and wanted to put out something that represents what we consider best practices for the industry that we hope people will adopt and follow. The standard includes a lot of definitions, 41 definitions, many of them taken from the MUTCD and from OSHA regulations, definitions of competent persons, of what constitutes a highway, of internal traffic control plans, which we'll talk about later, positive protection devices, and transportation management plans. Okay, I'm going to talk first about the traffic control section. It begins by a requirement that you have to comply with the latest MUTCD, which just came out in December. You're required under the standard to pre-plan the job for safety, materials, staffing, and traffic control. Because we know that planning the job, if you pre-plan the job, it's much easier to do the job safely. You're required in the standard to prepare a traffic control plan and communicate it to the authority that's in charge before the work begins and whenever there are any changes made. Positive protection is one of the most important things in highway work to protect the construction workers that are doing the work on the road. And we require in the standard positive protection whenever, first of all, when there's no means of escape. For example, if you're doing bridge or tunnel work, if the project is 2 weeks or longer duration, if there's high-speed traffic, which we define as greater than or more than 45 miles per hour, and especially if there's high volumes of traffic. And lastly, if workers are working close to the traffic lane. There are requirements for traffic control, setup, and removal. First, we require proper training and supervision. We require automatic deployment devices. We ask that they be used wherever feasible for deploying traffic cones, or you have a protected area of the vehicle with a fall restraint system. We ask that they be deployed and retrieved in a safe manner, and that you add a truck-mounted attenuator or law enforcement if there is high-speed traffic in the vicinity. The setup for the traffic control devices has to be inspected daily by a qualified person, and more often if there's heavy traffic, frequent damage, poor visibility, bad weather, or if there's been a vehicle intrusion. All signs should be covered or removed when you're not working. Construction vehicles should be distinguished with lighting or signage so that for work zone access, so that construction vehicles are not followed into the work zone. And you should close the traffic lane whenever you're working in aerial lifts over an open traffic lane or a shoulder. Speed management is always an important issue. We recommend in the standard that you reduce speeds when needed through the use of a variety of mechanisms, as is laid out in Subpart K. Reduced speed limits, speed advisories, increased fines, photo enforcement where it's allowed, in those states where it's allowed, the use of speed displays, law enforcement, and portable changing message signs. Flaggers are particularly at risk. We know there's about 20, 25 flaggers that are killed every year on the highways. So what we say is that flaggers should be used only when the other means of slowing the traffic are infeasible. Flaggers need to be positioned in the safest location, facing the traffic, in a closed lane or on the shoulder, and only in an open lane once traffic has stopped. Single flaggers are only allowed on the shoulder when there is good visibility. We ask that more than one flagger be used if there's low visibility, and if exposure to traffic cannot be minimized, we ask that to give visual warnings of the flagger and to use jersey barriers, spotters, or visual assistance devices like hard hat mirrors. We require Class 2 clothing be worn during the day and Class 3 clothing at night. And this follows pretty closely the new MUTCD that came out in December. We require illumination of flagger stations at night, that you provide an escape plan for flaggers. Flaggers have to be provided with adequate brakes and replacement flaggers. We say flaggers must use stop and slow paddles and only use flags in emergency situations. And that traffic control devices must conform to the latest MUTCD. And lastly, that traffic signals should not be in conflict with flagger signals so that motorists don't get confused. Of course, flaggers have to have adequate training. And we give a list of things that flaggers must be trained on. Communication skills, escape procedures, using signaling devices, traffic control procedures, recognizing dangerous situations, emergency response, personal protective equipment, and other worksite conditions. And we say that the employer must keep the records of flagger training for at least a year. And lastly, with regard to flaggers, we have some other additional requirements that they use two-way radios whenever visual or audio contact is not possible between flaggers. And we do have provisions for automated flagger assistance devices, which is now in the new MUTCD. But we say they should be used only when there's one lane of traffic approaching, and they must be illuminated at night. We also say that flaggers should not respond or retaliate to frustrated motorists. They should notify their supervisor under those conditions. And lastly, we allow for the use of intrusion warning devices to give workers and flaggers an additional few seconds notice if there's a car that's intruded. We have a section on runover and backover prevention because this is the #1 hazard facing workers. I think flaggers are often injured by motorists, but the construction workers inside the work zone are more often injured or killed by construction vehicles running over or backing them over. So what we say is that on all construction vehicles, the mirrors must be in good working order. Workers must be protected from traffic by jersey barriers, spotters, or other assisted devices. Workers must not stand or walk on the side of a raised dump body. Backup alarms must be supplemented with mechanical backing assistance devices, such as radar or video cameras. This is, for example, a requirement now in Washington State. And they must be supplemented with visual alarms at night. If that's not feasible, then spotters must be used. Spotters can be in danger of being run over. They must be trained, not stand in the path of the equipment, remain in the driver's sight, and train drivers. The employer has to train the drivers to stop if they can't see the spotter, and they are required to wear high visibility clothing. We do include a section here on internal traffic control plans. This is something we have been working on for many years in close cooperation with NIOSH and ARTBA and NAPA, the Asphalt Pavement Association, and the Operating Engineers Union. The internal traffic control plan is very similar to the traffic control plan for motorists, but this is a plan for vehicles that are traveling within the work zone, the construction vehicles. In the standard, we require they be developed and communicated to all workers and vehicle operators. They can only be modified by the supervisor or safety person. Everyone on the site must be notified of any changes to the plan, and the plan will include a diagram, a list of equipment and personnel, a hazard checklist, safety notes, and a communications plan. And the point of this traffic control plan is to have some areas that are only for traffic, some areas that are for pedestrians that are free of traffic, and to try to minimize the amount of backing up that's done in the work zone, because for many of these vehicles, that's the most dangerous for pedestrians, is when they're backing up. We also have provisions for worker access and egress within the work zone. So there has to be a site-specific plan for how workers are going to get to and from their work, to the parking area, to sanitation facilities, to where they're going to have break times, and they're going to have to be paths to minimize pedestrian exposures to vehicles during those times. Equipment operator safety. Equipment operators have to inspect their equipment and have any defects corrected prior to their use. The equipment must be locked and tagged out for maintenance or repair work as required by the ANSI A10 standard. There is currently not a lockout tagout standard for construction from OSHA, but there is an ANSI standard, so we reference that. Rollover protection and seat belts are required on most construction vehicles. Seat belts must be worn during the operation, and their anchor points have to be inspected. Operators have to be qualified to run the type of equipment and the size of equipment they're going to be operating, and no riders are allowed on the equipment unless it's designed for multiple occupancy. Electrical safety. We have sections both for underground utilities and for above-ground utilities, overhead utilities. Obviously, you first have to determine the location of the utilities before the work starts. For example, by calling 811, the Universal Underground Utility number, or MIS utility. You have to maintain any markings until the work is complete. Use hand digging, vacuum excavation, etc. whenever you're close to determining the exact location. And protect the excavation during the operation from workers or the public so that people don't fall into it. Overhead power lines are also a common problem in road construction. And what we require is that the overhead lines be de-energized whenever possible prior to work. They should be treated as energized unless there's been some written verification from the owner or utility. There should be a daily briefing before the work begins. You should contact the owner and utility before the work begins, and there are minimum clearance distances specified, which increase if there's any kind of visibility problems or high wind. Accurate measuring devices are required. Proximity warning alarms, boom guards, insulating links are recommended as well. Qualified spotters are required whenever there's work near energized lines. I think when the OSHA crane and derrick standard comes out this summer, I think many of these provisions will also be incorporated into the new crane and derrick standard as well. Other provisions for overhead lines is that we have to keep workers away from any high-reaching equipment until the operator or qualified person determines it's safe. Should avoid using tag lines or use non-conductive ones if you need them. We recommend that you not store materials or equipment near power lines, that you plan the job to avoid any contact with power lines, and you plan, mark, and inspect any travel routes for high-reaching equipment. And during transport, that such equipment should be tied down, and that you not move haul or dump trucks with the box raised unless you have a spotter. Falls are also a problem in road construction, not so much falls from heights except for bridge construction and some overpass construction. Primarily slips and falls is the major issue. So what we do is we require clear pedestrian walkways, walking surfaces. If you're working at heights, we require guardrails where feasible, and we reference the ANSI standard for fall protection, A1032, if you're working above 6 feet. For floor openings, we require that they be covered, secured, and designed for twice the expected weight, inspected by a qualified person, and to follow the A1032 standard for fall protection if they can't be covered. Access and egress from equipment is also important because we have a lot of falls, people getting on or getting off of equipment. So we require safe access ladders and that they be free from debris. Ladders have to be kept in good working order. Workers have to be trained on their use and require three-point contact, and that workers follow subpart X of the OSHA standards and the ANSI A1014 standard for ladders. For scaffolds, we require they follow A10-8, which is the ANSI standard for scaffold safety. And for excavations, we require all workers be protected from falls into excavations, and that any crosswalks over 6 feet high be protected with guardrails. Being as this is a vertical standard, we also incorporate some requirements for health hazards. Basically, what we do is we list a number of health hazards that are common in road construction: heat and cold stress, noise, airborne hazards like silica or lead for bridge work, dermal hazards like cement, chemical hazards, solar radiation or sunlight, and for night work, lack of sleep. And we require that the hazards be controlled using the traditional hierarchy of controls, such as engineering controls first and then administrative controls, where engineering controls are not feasible, and lastly, personal protective equipment. Night work is becoming very common in road construction, so we have specific requirements for illumination, and many of these follow the OSHA standards and the Federal Highway report that came out, NHRCP 350, I believe it is. Night work projects require an illumination plan to describe where the lighting is going to be, what the illumination levels are, the light and power sources, and for glare control. Illumination levels and uniformity is set for different types of tasks. We require that work be discontinued if lighting fails, except in emergency situations. Vehicle lights have to be in good order and supplemented, and we require that glare be minimized, such as with use of balloon lights. We recognize there still is quite a bit of personal protective equipment being used. So for most of these standards, we reference other personal protective equipment standards, other ANSI standards. For high visibility clothing, we require that they follow the current MUTCD. For head protection, the ANSI Z89.1 standard. For eye and face protection, the E87.1 standard and the OSHA standard, 1926-95. For hearing protection, follow the new ANSI standard A1046, which is on hearing loss prevention in construction. And we also require here that engineering controls be instituted first before hearing protection is put into place. Require that appropriate clothing is being worn and provided for weather protection where needed, and gloves where their use is required. And where respirators are required, we require they follow the OSHA standard 1910-134 and the ANSI standard Z88.6. For footwear, we require the ASTM standard F2413, and that sandals and athletic footwear is prohibited for use. Okay, and lastly, there's a number of other ancillary requirements for power tools. We require guarding and grounding using GFCI's ground fault circuit interrupters, and that gloves be required, where they're required, to use the ANSI S340 standard to require that they reduce vibration levels. Musculoskeletal problems is the largest injury problem in road construction, and we require that you follow the new ANSI standard A1040, which is on the reduction of musculoskeletal problems in construction. For excavation safety, there is a relevant ANSI standard that we reference here, A1012. And for paving operations, there is a separate ANSI standard for paving operations, A1017. So that's a quick summary of the standard. Obviously, there's a lot more details, and I don't know if there are any questions, but we'll go to the questions section, I guess. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Scott. I'm going to invite those who are watching the webinar to look at the lower left-hand section of their screen. There they can see a box where you can type and send in questions that we will then share with Scott. The first question that we have this morning is, will this new A1047 standard be incorporated into OSHA Subpart G, and will OSHA be able to cite a contractor if an unsafe issue is found?
That's a good question. OSHA is now putting together their regulatory agenda for the coming years. And we really don't have any. There's a new regulatory agenda coming out in the next month. OSHA sometimes incorporates new ANSI standards, but the regulatory process is very slow. And I don't anticipate that they're going to incorporate this into the OSHA standards in the near future. But it's certainly something that they will consider, I'm sure. There aren't many OSHA standards that cover road construction except the sign, signals, and barricade standard that was mentioned. But we're hopeful that they'll either reference the new MUTCD that came out in December or reference this standard at some point, particularly with regard to the use of high visibility clothing in road construction.
Along those regards, Scott, could you explain, we know that the new MUTCD that came out in December references now or requires the high visibility clothing for all highway workers. That will not be effective, I think there was a year or two.
Until December.
Until December. However, we know that OSHA has also recently issued, about 6 months ago, a new letter guideline about using the general duty clause to enforce high visibility garments, which I believe is effective immediately. How does that relate with the new standard?
Right. Well, OSHA can use what's called the general duty clause to cite an employer if they're not addressing a recognized hazard. And being as there is now the MUTCD requirement on all highways, not just federally funded highways, and there's the new ANSI standard, OSHA can then cite employers under this new memorandum that came out, saying they're going to cite them and say, well, the industry clearly recognizes that this is a requirement, it should be a requirement, and therefore, if you're not following that requirement, if you're not following that practice, then they can give you a citation under what they call the general duty clause to provide a safe workplace for all your employees.
Very good. Here's the next question. Can you explain at a high level the responsibilities and accountabilities for the owner, such as a state DOT, as compared to the contractor when it comes to the requirements of this new standard in regard to pre-planning, positive protection, internal traffic controls, etc.? In many cases, the DOT will have the ultimate say in the type and design of temporary traffic control systems devices, that they may not always track what the contractor feels is the safest approach for their workers. For example, what recourse is available to the contractor if the work situation dictates the use of barriers for positive protection, but the DOT does not agree and will not pay for this item?
Right. Well, in the new rules that came out for Subpart K, there is a requirement that the owners, the state DOTs, have to have a plan on how they're going to pay for safety equipment, and positive barriers would be included in that. So we're going to be very interested to see how this pans out, and because what it does is it creates a level playing field. We're saying there is going to be a separate pay item for such equipment, and what we hope is that since there's a separate pay item, it'll be very clear from the owners, from the DOTs, what will be paid for, and then the contract will be reimbursed for that. We're hoping that with this kind of guidance that we're providing here and other guidance we're developing with ARTBA for positive protection and the new guidance that ATS is putting out, that there'll be gradually an increased use of positive protection to protect workers who are doing this kind of work. If there's a dispute, I think what the contractor can do is probably, I mean, the owner's paying, but I think the contractor can then go to the owner and say, this is the current practice, the best practice in the industry, and this is what the guidance from Federal Highway is saying, and use that hopefully to encourage the state DOT to include that in all bids.
And perhaps just to clarify, Scott, you referenced the new standard Subpart K. That's part of the new Federal Highway standards for those who may not be familiar there. Okay, next question. Actually, this has two parts. First part, what is the purpose of the ANSI standard related to temporary traffic control if this is all covered in the MUTCD? Is it just to continue or combine numerous guidelines, standards into one document? That's part one. And part two is then who is responsible for ensuring the standard is complied with, the DOT, contractors, etc.?
Right. Well, in part, like I said, this is a vertical standard. And I think we wanted to incorporate all the requirements that relate to worker safety into one document. The MUTCD does address worker safety in Part 6, but it doesn't address all these aspects of it, and the OSHA standard is silent in many of these areas. So we wanted to put it all in one document, and the temporary traffic controls we believe were relevant in terms of ensuring worker safety on the site. So we did include them, although much of what we included references the MUTCD. And what was the second part of that question?
The second part is who is responsible for compliance, ensuring the contractors DOT comply.
Right. Well, what we anticipate is, I mean, this is a voluntary standard. It's not required. But what we anticipate is that now that it's finished, that many state DOTs may reference it and say, we want you to comply with this ANSI standard, in which case the DOT then would have responsibility for making sure that it's followed since they're the owner, I would think.
Very good. We've had several questions, kind of a long time. Next question, and I can answer this, and the question is, how do they get a copy of this presentation? Just as we mentioned, this will be archived on workzonesafety.org, the Workzone Clearinghouse, the PowerPoint presentation, as well as the webinar. So that will be available shortly on the Clearinghouse. Next question. What is the definition for a traffic control supervisor? It seems they'll be required on all work zones. Can a regular supervisor also be a traffic control supervisor?
Okay, let me look it up so I don't get it wrong. We define in the standard, a traffic control supervisor as a person designated to assume overall responsibility for the safety and operational aspects of the work zone setup and conformance with the temporary traffic control devices with the traffic control plan. That's how it's defined here, and I'm not sure if that's identical to the definition in Subpart K or not, or is it?
I don't think it's defined in Subpart K.
Yeah, it may be there. So I would also check Subpart K of the Federal Highway regulations.
Okay, a person who came in a little bit late to the webinar is wondering if Class 3 garments are going to be required on all roadways with speeds above 50 miles per hour. You know, and is this going to be effect in December?
I believe in the MUTCD, Class 3 garments are recommended. In this ANSI standard, we require them for night work only. So
Class 2
is the minimum.
Okay. Are there any requirements in this standard related to bilingual training?
That's a good question. I don't believe we address that in the standard. There is an ANSI standard on training for safety and health in construction, and I believe that's being revised right now, and I'm sure that'll probably be addressed in that standard. I should also mention this standard just came out, was finished in November, and it went into effect at the end of February. But like all ANSI standard, every ANSI standard is reviewed and updated or reaffirmed every 5 years. So although this was written before the METCD came out, the new one, we believe there aren't any real contradictions. And we will be revising this in a couple of years as technology changes and practices change.
Good. A question here, what role did the state DOTs play in the development of this standard?
Okay, we had 45 people that were on our work group, and there were a number of state DOTs, folks that reviewed it and were involved in the development of it, including people like Jim Bryden in New York State, who used to be with the state DOT, and I can't tell you exactly which states. I don't have the list in front of me, but there were a number of folks from state DOTs involved.
Good. All right, the ANSI standard references illumination at a level of 1.50 lux for all areas of the work zone, including tapers during night work and during setup and removal of temporary traffic control devices. Can you explain the approach that is visualized to be able to accomplish this requirement in the field?
I believe this requirement basically came from the illumination requirements in the OSHA standards. And I don't really have any comment on how to accomplish that in the field. I mean, light meters are fairly easy to obtain, and I would think that you have to develop a lighting plan and adjust your lighting to try to make sure that it's uniform and that it achieves those levels at a minimum throughout the work zone.
A question here regarding internal traffic control plans, a good question, I believe. Where can you indicate where you can find a good example of internal traffic control plans for reference and provide examples of plans that are actually used on recent projects?
Right. If you go to the Work Zone Clearinghouse, there is a document that we developed with OSHA several years ago that explains what an internal traffic control plan is, how to develop it, gives a couple of examples, and some assistance in developing one.
I might also mention that currently NIOSH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, is developing some training regarding this that should be out in a year or so.
Right.
So there is this is fairly new stuff, but there is stuff coming along. Okay, next question. According to your previous statement, communication skills for flaggers are very important. I have encountered a few flaggers that did not speak English but were certified as flaggers. Question is, are flaggers required to speak English?
There's no requirements in the standard that pertain to that. It's a good question and maybe something we'll address in revisions to the standard. It's not addressed in the standard as it exists right now.
Okay. Is there a standard covering employee use of portable electronic devices in the work zone, like cell phones, iPods, those types of things?
It is addressed briefly. For example, I think there's some provisions with regard to flaggers and equipment operators not using those devices when they're on the job. But I don't know exactly which sections, but I think it's addressed for those two tasks.
Okay. Is there any training requirements that are specified for traffic control supervisors?
That's not specified here in this standard. I know it's being addressed by some state DOTs now. There's a lot of discussion about that, and I think Federal Highway has been looking at that too, but it's not specifically addressed in this standard.
Okay. Question from Hawaii. How will the new standards affect work zone areas for county roads? And also, is balloon lighting the best type of light for minimized glare?
I don't know that county roads will be any different than any other roads in terms of addressing these hazards. And in terms of balloon lighting, I don't know that it's necessarily the best, but I think it does have some advantages in terms of glare reduction.
Yeah, and I think maybe a point going to the earlier part of the question about what roads are affected, it doesn't say it's for highways, but if you look at the definitions of the standard, that highways is a broad definition for, I believe, all types
right,
of roadways.
Exactly. Thank you very much.
Okay, next question. There's some vague references in the standard. When referring to qualified as one who is defined as a competent person as defined in the OSHA standard, what is the definition of good or low visibility?
Definition of good? I'm not sure exactly which section you're referring to, or low visibility. I think We have not defined things like low visibility in terms of how the distance that you can see clearly. I mean, I think those things could be defined, and if there's a need for that.
Yeah, and I think this one wasn't necessarily related to the lighting standard, but it was more just, it talks about there are some terms such as competent qualified persons that are well defined that we refer to. Right. Other times when I guess the standard says good or low, right. How are those defined?
Right, and they're not defined, and maybe over time they will be if there's a need for that. Okay, good.
Next question. For a roadway contract, if there's a conflict between the contract provisions and the standard, what governs? During the administration of a roadway contract, can the project engineer violate or change requirements in the standard? Is the traffic control responsible for the design of the traffic control plan?
Well, I mean, like we said, this is a voluntary standard, and none of these provisions are required by law, except for those that are referenced, like the OSHA standards or MUTCD. And I think where there's a conflict, I would think you discuss that with the owner and figure out what the best practice is, what's going to be most protective, and we do, like I said, give exceptions where the exact provisions of the standard can be modified for infeasibility, et cetera, as long as you're providing equivalent protection.
Very good. I believe this is our last question, and the question is it correct to say if there is a difference between the MUTCD and the ANSI standard, the MUTCD should be followed? Would that be a correct statement?
I don't believe that there are any provisions in here that require less protection than the MUTCD. I think what will happen is some of these provisions go beyond the MUTCD, so the MUTCD should be considered like all federal standards at a minimum, and if you want to go beyond that, perhaps, and feel it's needed in a particular circumstance, I think the ANSI standard could be followed. It's not required. Like I said earlier, it's a voluntary standard.
Well, very good. Well, thank you, Scott, for joining us on this webinar. I think it's been very informative. And just as a reminder, this webinar will be immediately archived onto the Work Zone Safety Information Clearinghouse. Soon thereafter, we'll have the PowerPoint loaded as well. So all this information will be available for on-demand viewing in the future. And again, that's workzonesafety.org if you'd like to see more, review the presentation, or obtain a copy of the PowerPoint. Also, as a reminder, if you're interested in obtaining professional development hours for watching this webinar, you can follow the links also posted at the Clearinghouse and referenced here on the slide, and you'll be able to obtain professional development hours for attending this webinar. Finally, we'd like to thank very much the American Society of Safety Engineers for joining us and presenting this webinar, for making it available to us. And again, they're offering a 20% discount for those who would like to purchase a copy of the standard. And it's available, again, the links are provided here, as well as they'll be on the website for future reference. I'm not sure how long that'll remain live with ASSE, but at least for the next 24 hours, we're assured. So we thank you very much for joining us for this webinar. If you have any questions, please, again, send them to the Clearinghouse. We'll be glad to answer questions, even that may come in after the webinar is over. And we'll invite Scott to answer those webinars, and we'll post them also on that page. So thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time for our next Work Zone Clearinghouse webinar. Thank you very much.